Hi, Kaveh. Nice to see you again. How are you?
You too. I'm very good.
Excellent. So maybe let's start for those who are going to be watching the video or maybe listening in. Let's talk about yourself a little bit and a little bit of an introduction about the work that you do.
Well, I'm a director and a cinematographer and sometimes an editor, and I'm also a musician. And yeah, I mean, I make films that I think are very musical, I hope.
Mhm.
Yeah, I try to make films that feel like music, I guess you could say, and I try to make music that feels like film and try to I try to like exist in that space. And I'm obviously really interested in different kinds of people and different cultures and different kind of music, and I think a lot of the work that I do kind of falls under that rubric.
Excellent. Yeah, you have quite a list of work uh, for people if they're interested on your website. But what brings us here today is your latest film, your first feature. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I've done some like long-ish documentaries, but I
Hmm.
wouldn't, this is a very different thing. Fiction feature is a whole different thing.
Right.
And I also did the Seven Last Words project, which brought together seven different directors.
Hmm.
So that was a feature-length project as well, which I'm super proud of. But this is the first one that's kind of, my vision all the way through.
Great. So the film is called Sin La Habana, and it's actually filmed in Havana and also in Montreal. So let's just set it up for folks, maybe without giving too much away. Where did this story come from? I was reading that you kind of worked with Pablo Herrera on some of the writing. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so I was actually in Cuba. It was like around 2005,
Mm.
and I was there as a musician. I was just, it was like around the time of the Buena Vista Social Club, and everybody was obsessed with Cuba, and so I was obsessed too. And so I went there with this kind of romantic notion of what Cuba's like, and then discovered that it's a lot more complex than the story that we were being given. Um, so right away, I was kind of fascinated by the way that Cubans deal with foreigners, because it's quite different than how other people deal with foreigners, partly
Mhm.
because of the way Cubans are viewed and the way that Cubans are exotified. So I just found that relationship interesting off the bat. And they're living in this, what a lot of people deem this golden prison where there's everyone's educated and there's a reasonable health system and there's all these great things, especially compared to other neighboring Caribbean countries. But at the same time, unless you're a well-known musician or dancer or a politician, you can never leave that island. And
Mhm.
that's something that I think that tourists who go there can't really wrap their heads around. It's like, yeah, it's
Right.
great here, but if you live in Cuba, you just can't, you can never even go and find out what the rest of the world is like.
Mhm.
And so for a lot of people, that's a really difficult kind of constraint. And so yeah, so I was interested in those kind of power dynamics. And then Pablo Herrera is a friend of a former bandmate of mine, and he used to be, I mean, kind of the biggest hip hop producer in Cuba.
Mhm.
He produced Orishas and a bunch of big, kind of a lot of the big hip hop records of the late '90s and early 2000s. And so he invited me to come over and play some horn on some of his tracks, and I did. And then we kind of became friends. And one day we were walking around, and he was asking me what my favorite film was, and I didn't expect him to have a very intense film education, because I didn't realize that there's such a cinephile culture in Cuba.
Yes.
And yeah, he asked me what my favorite recent film was, and I said it's Happy Together by Wong Kar
Mm.
Wai. And he was like, well, I like that one, but I prefer Fallen Angels. And then I was like, okay, this guy knows his stuff. And then
Right.
going on about Peter Greenaway and all these things. I was like, okay, this is really interesting. And his main thing is that he wanted to show an accurate portrayal of Afro-Cuban culture,
Mm.
because Afro-Cuban culture, when viewed from the outside, is often very much exotified, in this way that's been going on for centuries now, kind of this like noble, savage, mysterious thing. And then
Right.
even within Cuban cinema, there's some of that, or there's this kind of, or Afro-Cuban culture is kind of like marginalized and put to the side. And so he wanted to make a film where Afro-Cuban culture is front and center, but it's not a film about Afro-Cuban culture. It's a film where people exist within Afro-Cuban culture. So between that interest of his and my interest in showing a story about this relationship between tourists and Cubans, that was kind of where the story sprung from.
Okay, that's quite interesting. It's funny how one conversation will spark all kinds of ideas, right?
Was it sparked like a 16-year-old relationship?
Well, that too. So having decided that you wanted to have this look at sort of the experience of foreigners in Cuba through the eyes of, or through the lives of three people. So, you know, we have, who do we have? We have Leonardo, Sara, and Nassim. How did you decide whether or not you decided on your own or with Pablo, the way that they were going to be intertwined or connected?
Well, so yeah, I mean, there's this idea of jineterismo that is is like kind of particular to Cuba. The way that it functions in Cuba is particular, and I feel like even within Cuban culture, jineteros are viewed in this very negative way. It's this very pejorative kind of thing, and there's this idea of this duality, like you're either one thing or you're a jinetero. And there's actually a lot of transactional friendship and a lot of transactional relationships that end up happening in Cuba because it's a way for people to escape their circumstances or to change their circumstances. And so spending time there, we interviewed a lot of people and talked to people about why they wanted to leave and what they would be willing to do to leave. And this idea of an Afro-Cuban dancer who hits a glass ceiling in the Cuban ballet, which is a very real thing, that he would try to find a way out, just made a lot of sense. It's like, I actually met a lot of dancers who had been through similar experiences.
Right.
And so, so the idea of showing a ballet dancer, because ballet is not really something that people know about. They don't know much about Cuban ballet unless you know about ballet, in which case the ballet dancers are amongst the best in the world. Partly because it was under this Soviet influence for so long. So there's these like incredible Russian teachers that came and in Cuba, and so it was an opportunity to show how amazing Cuban ballet dancers are and to show the world of Cuban ballet, because everybody knows about the jazz thing and the salsa thing, but people don't necessarily know about this side of Cuban culture, which is a very powerful thing. So anyway, that was kind of why we picked a dancer. And then, the idea that he would be pushed into this kind of semi-jinetero role by his girlfriend was also, I thought, an interesting flip on the way we usually talk about sex tourism, where it's the woman who's this victim of the foreign predator. And one thing I wanted to play a lot with was the idea of who is the predator and who's the naive victim, and not have it be a good guy and a bad guy, or a good girl and a bad, have it be really like, these are humans dealing with really complicated situations, sometimes making bad decisions, but no one's out for blood. No one's trying to do something particularly awful. People are just trying to live their dreams. And then, so the other side of that is, of course, the foreigner who comes to Cuba.
Right.
So it's really easy, when you get on the plane from Havana to get back to Montreal or whatever, you see all these older women with younger Cuban guys, or older white men with younger Cuban women, or men with men, or whatever it is. But there's often this dynamic of the wealthy, powerful tourist, and it's very easy to make a snap judgment about what's going on there. And I was really interested in the idea of like, okay, well, what brought this woman to this place? Why is this woman, this particular woman, why is she in need of this exotic experience? Why does she want to put herself in that position? And so again, I interviewed a lot of people. I interviewed a lot of people who sponsored Cubans to come and live with them, and just to get a sense of what's the humanity behind this decision. And so this woman is kind of an amalgamation of people from my own family, because my family is Iranian Jewish, like hers. And then also with just other women and other men who had brought Cubans up to live in Canada or New York or wherever. and just try to get a sense of what brought them to that position. Because if you're super happy and everything's going well in your life, you're not necessarily going to go down to Cuba and sponsor somebody who you barely know to come live with you. Like
Right.
that's not how humans work. It's because there's other stuff that's going on. And so, yeah, rather than looking at the sex tourist as this evil, messed up person, I was like, okay, well, what's going on here? So a lot of, I guess, if you take a step back, the whole film is about looking at what's going on in a situation that can seem very clear.
Right. Yeah, no, and I appreciate that in the film, because I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with, we just see the images of, everybody having a great time when you traveled there, and or people from here bringing things back because Cubans need things, but the situation is much more complex than that. So it kind of opens that door for dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even the question of power is interesting, because the foreign older woman has the power to give somebody a passport and money, but also the Cuban guy or lady or whatever has the power to give somebody something that they've been missing as well, to give them a feeling of power, to give them a feeling of attractiveness, a feeling of belonging. And so that transaction isn't as one-sided as it might seem. Both people are getting something out of this.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot that we could basically unravel if we had to, but I actually don't want to give too much away, because I really do think people should watch the film. But there's a few things about the film that I really, really loved, and maybe let's segue into the music side of things, because you work with a music producer who really knows Cuban hip hop and other music, and also the dancing. So maybe tell us a little bit about choosing the songs and collaborating with the actors on those dance scenes.
Sure. So musically, I ended up writing most of the music myself, which was actually a really exciting thing for me to do. Yeah, it was awesome, because I was trying to license all these like reggaeton songs and rapton and reparto songs that are what people are really listening to right now in Centro Habana.
Right.
And the problem is, international licensing of Cuban music turns out to be super hard, because the rules are totally different there. And not only that, Cubans don't necessarily have to clear samples in order to, make a song. So even if I could get the rights to the writing of the song, I couldn't necessarily get the rights to the sample of the song, and it started getting so complicated.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so I just started, so I bought a drum machine and learned how to do it. I based it on the music that I was hearing down there, and I worked with people, Cubans and in Montreal, to make a soundscape that hopefully feels like the vibe of Centro Habana. Even if it's not exactly the music that people are listening to, I think it's got the energy of Centro Habana in it. And so that was super fun for me, because what it also meant that I could do was that I could make it be consistent. Instead of like licensing a whole bunch of different things in different keys and different, energies, I could, even if I was going for a different energy from one song to the next, I could keep a melodic aspect or harmonic idea or rhythmic idea. And so I think, or I hope anyway, that the film feels cohesive musically, like as a, even though it's going into like, old kind of crooner music from Cuba, and then like modern, almost like house music, and then there was a sense that I was going to be able to like combine it all into one consistent feeling. And that was a huge challenge, but also really fun and really exciting. And of course, Pablo had a lot of input into, he's like an encyclopedia of Cuban music. So he was able to, pull up a lot of things that would influence me in the writing of the music. And then in terms of the dance, I ended up working with Yona Acosta, who is Carlos Acosta's nephew. So Carlos Acosta is, one of the greatest dancers of the last 20 years. And yeah, Yona is his nephew, and Yona himself is a great dancer as well. He's the principal of the Munich Staatsballet right now, and previously of the English National Ballet. So I mean, he's one of the great dancers in the world, really.
Right.
And so the question was whether he could act or not. And so
yes.
I went to Munich, and and it was kind of a funny, awkward conversation at a Starbucks. And I took out my phone and we did a little scene in the Starbucks. And it wasn't totally conclusive, but it was actually, but I could see that the guy had a drive to do this. And he's a natural performer, and ballet is one very specific way of performing. And I think that he was interested in the idea of kind of diversifying the way that he performs and interacts as an artist. So he was into it, and it was really important to me not to work with an actor and have the actor try to learn how to dance ballet like in 3 months or something, because ballet is something you got to, I mean, I think Yona started when he was 4. Like you got to start that stuff young, and it changes how your body grows, it changes how you stand, it changes how you walk. And to try to have an actor faking all that all the time is just like, no, it can't be. It's got to be someone who has ballet in their bones. And so that's why I chose to work with a dancer instead of an actor.
Right.
And then the choreography, I mean, some of the choreography is just classical ballet choreography, Yaktion solo. But then there's also this kind of dance that mixes Afro-Cuban dance with ballet that comes back throughout, kind of in 16 millimeter, and it's kind of this dream dance. So that was choreographed by Julio Hong, who plays the role of Julio in the film, and is also a former ballet dancer himself. And he used to be in Maui Shui Nao's dance company in Montreal. So he's a real dancer, even though he kind of comes across as a thug in the movie. And he was actually him who put me in touch with Yona, because basically whenever someone leaves Cuba,
there's a network.
Yeah, there's a huge network of kind of expat Cuban dancers, and Julio knows them all.
Nice.
And I mean, the reality is there's not that many Afro-Cuban dancers outside of Cuba, and I couldn't work with an Afro-Cuban dancer from Cuba because no company would let them leave.
Right.
And there's a kind of, because they would be worried that if someone left, they would defect.
Not come back.
Yeah, which is probably true. So
yeah.
So that's how we ended up with Yona, and I mean, Yona turned out to be perfect, I think.
Yes.
And then Sara, who's played by Evelyn O'Farrell, I mean, she's a former ballet dancer as well, and she has this huge training in Afro-Cuban dance, and she's just an incredible dancer and an amazing presence, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very lovely to watch.
Oh, good.
On screen. Yeah, very nice to watch on screen.
Yeah. So Julio kind of put the whole thing together dance-wise, and they're such great dancers that they were able to express it in a way that was convincing. And I just love filming dance, and my cinematographer, Juan Pablo Ramirez, who's a Mexican EP, he also just kind of loves that. And so it's just so fun to play with the camera movement and the body movement, and to try to tell the story through movement rather than dialogue. That was always a challenge. It's like, okay, can we do this through a look or through a movement, or how much of the story can we tell through the dance? Right.
Well, you brought me to my next theme that I always like to ask about, which is cinematography and your DP, because it's not just the camera angles, it's also the color palettes that you've used in the film. So I'm curious about what that discussion was like, or also filming in Cuba versus filming in Montreal, Canada.
Yeah, well, very different.
Yes.
But I mean, what's amazing in Cuba is that you turn a camera on and it's going to look interesting, because it's just such a photogenic place, and people are so photogenic, and people are doing interesting things. And you turn a camera on in Montreal in the middle of winter, and it's just going to be white or gray, brown. So in some ways, the color palette shows itself naturally, but we're also very specific about it. So everybody in the film, every one of the main characters, so Julio, Leonardo, Nassim, and Sarah, are all based on different orishas, which are the gods of Santeria.
Right.
And the actual story is based on a Santeria story. It's kind of like there's these 256 stories in Santeria that are called pataquis, and a lot of the divination and like the kind of the oracle work of Santeria, your life is explained via these 256 stories. Right. So this film is kind of a modern take on one of those stories, which is the Ogbeshe story. That's probably all sounds a little bit far-flung, but each orisha has a set of characteristics. So like Chango is red and white, those are his colors, and
Right.
he's the god of fire and lightning and thunder and dance. And so Leonardo is Chango in a way. He's almost like the avatar of Chango in the real world. And then Sara is based on Oshun, who's the goddess of fertility and rivers and honey. And then Nasim is based on Oya, who's the goddess of wind and change, and the colors blue and purple. And so, you'll often hear when Nasim's around, you'll hear the wind in the distance. And so it's kind of like the characters defined, the orishas defined the characteristics of each of the main characters, but also really determined the color palette. So Leonardo's always wearing red and white. Sara's always dressed in yellow. We could also, it was like, okay, how can we give a clue that something's about to happen? What if we like take out this color? Like, what if we take out red? It means that he's not feeling at home. There's like,
right.
We put red back into it. It means that he's more in control. Same with the yellow. So it created this kind of like, we made all these diagrams of which scenes should have which colors. And I mean, that's a thing that DPs love, because we're telling the story.
I can imagine, yes.
And I love it too. It's like,
right.
Yeah, I mean, anytime we can tell the story sensorially rather than through people talking, I think that it's that's what I'm always aiming to do.
Right. And it just gives a different vibe, I think, altogether, right? And I think you posted something recently online where it's like it's immersive, and I think that's where it comes through the visual, the auditory, and all of the other elements that you use to tell the story in that film.
Well, what I've heard from some people, which is really nice, is that they can feel the heat in Havana, and that, obviously we're not changing the temperature in the theater. So it's, if we're able to create a sensation of heat through light and sound, I mean, that's all it is. It's just lights and shadows being projected on a screen and a bunch of sound waves coming out of the speaker. We can create a feeling of warmth or of coldness or of tension through that. That's the magic of cinema. Right.
So let's talk about your casting, because we already talked about them sort of around the way in terms of, Yona, how did you, so now we heard how you met Yona through Julio, and Julio is now in the film. What about, you have Evelyn, is it Aki, her first name, who plays Nasim? How did you decide on the two of them?
So Evelyn was more of a kind of classic casting call. We did someone's apartment in Havana, and we just had a bunch of actresses come through. There's actually a lot of talented ones, but it wasn't exactly right. And then when Evelyn came in, it was just like, oh my God, please let her be able to act, because she looks like Oshun already. Like, she looks like this goddess, and she has so much presence, and she's like 6 feet tall, And so she came in, and then it turned out she could act, and it was just like, okay. And there was no question that she was the right person for that job. And then for Aki, I mean, basically we auditioned every Iranian actress in Canada, like a lot by, Skype auditions and stuff. And what's special about Aki is that she has a big inner life that's not always, that has a certain kind of mystery to it. And I thought that was really interesting. I didn't want to make a film where everything was too easy. It's like, oh, well, she's like this because this. I think people are more complicated than that. And I could feel that from Aki, that she's got, a rich and complex inner life herself. And so she was able to bring that to the character, and we actually modified the character somewhat to be more like Aki. And then I think, she just won an award for Best Actress at the which is awesome.
Yeah, so that's right. You've made your round through various festivals and done quite well. So congrats on that. What has it been screened anywhere in Cuba? I feel like I'm missing something.
It hasn't yet.
Okay.
And I was told that the Havana Film Festival was canceled this year because of all the problems that have been going on. And I guess at the last minute, they brought it back, so it's actually happening next week, but the film's not there. So that's a
Right.
bummer. But
Yeah.
my hope is to go next year. I mean, it's super important to me to show it there. It's such a I mean, it's such a Cuban film, and I think that Cubans will be able to relate. Cubans who have left and Cubans who haven't left, I think, will both get something out of it. And I'm really interested in the dialogue with Cuban people about it, because so far it's been
Right.
a lot. And I've spoken to some Cuban expats about
Okay.
it. That's
Yeah.
been always really interesting. For the most part, they really like it, which is nice. You know, it was important to me to make a film that would ring true with Cuban people. But I'm curious to see how it plays on the island for sure.
Yeah, I'd be curious as well. That's why I asked you, because I know you took it to Miami as well. What was the
Yeah.
reception like there?
Well, that was what was. I mean, that's so interesting. Is that different people will just consume the film in such different ways. Miami is
Yes.
so like Republican and anti-Castro that people were like, "Oh, great! This is a great anti-Castro, anti-dictator film." I was like, "Wait, what?
Oh, wow.
That wasn't my goal. If like, I'm glad you enjoyed it, but that wasn't what I was trying to do with this film. For sure, we're showing there's problems in Cuba, but I think I was also hopefully showing the beauty of the place.
Right.
But to kind of the classic Miami Cubans are like, do you see people have to get out of Cuba? It's so horrible there. This is another just like more proof of the terrible problems and the dictatorship.
Mhm.
Oh, interesting. Okay. That wasn't my plan, but interesting that
Mhm.
you took it that way.
Interesting. And what about, you had a really good run in Montreal.
Yeah.
What was the feedback there?
I mean, it's been amazing, to be honest.
Mhm.
It was such a long time from the time that the film was finished to it actually coming to a theater that
Mhm.
my expectations were kind of low, to be honest.
Mhm.
And then we had this huge event outside with like 400 people and bands and Afro-Cuban dancing, and it was amazing.
Right.
Great start. And then it started playing in theaters, and the first few is like, there'd be like 5 or 6 people, and I was like, okay, it's hard to watch, but that's what happens. No problem. It's COVID. It's okay. But like this kind of word of mouth thing started happening, and it
Yes.
actually worked for once, and it was amazing. Like I went to it was like 6 or 7 weeks in cinemas, like in like all the time. And then since then it's been playing at the Cinema Moderne, which is a repertory theater in Montreal, occasionally. And I went on Wednesday and it was sold out, and people were like really so into it. And it feels amazing after all basically the suffering you put into making a movie. But
Right.
when it connects and people feel something and are engaging with you and with the film, it's a beautiful feeling.
Nice. And it finally made its way to Toronto, because I feel like I've missed it at some of the virtual festivals. So it's kind of nice to be able to catch it somewhere in person.
Yeah.
Because it's very different to watch things at home versus having other people to react with you at the
Absolutely.
same time.
And I mean, I think that's true of all films. This film in particular, because I tried to make it so sensorial and immersive. I think it's a cool movie if you watch it on your laptop, but I think that if you experience it in a cinema with the sound really surrounding you and the image and the light hitting you, it's a very different film and a very different experience.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are films that are kind of worth, sitting in the big, even if it is just 5 of you in the cinema. It's
Absolutely.
still a
Yeah.
good experience. That's what I tell people. Even if it's just you and one other person, it's still an experience.
I mean, sometimes the best thing is to be alone in the cinema. It's amazing. I love it.
Yeah, I've had that happen, and it is true. It's a different experience, and it's also just as good.
Yeah.
But so what happens with the film now that it's touring? Is it going to do any other cities around Canada or elsewhere that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I think from what I understand, the cinemas in Canada, it's still figuring out the whole COVID thing, and there's like a whole bunch of movies that were released, and so it's complicated to get a good slot. But my hope is that it'll come out in the rest of Canada. And I know there's offers for distribution in the US, which is great, and it's still got a bunch of film festivals. So it's life. It's still alive. It's still out there, and I hope that as many people can see it in theater as possible.
Great. So how do people know, how can people find out about the film? Do they go through your website, or what's the best way to stay up to date?
Well, there's a Cine La Habana Instagram. There's a Cine La Habana Facebook. Those probably have the most up-to-date
Okay.
things.
Perfect. I'll be sure to tag them.
Great. Yeah, and it'll be out on VOD, or it's already out on VOD actually. So that's another way to
Oh,
see it.
amazing. Okay, so that's good. And that would be on, that's not geo-blocked, is it? I don't think
That's
so.
geo-blocked to Canada, yeah.
To Canada. It's always good to ask these questions when we put these out into the world.
Yeah.
You know, make sure people know where they can access things and stay on the lookout for updates. So thank you so much, Kaveh. It was always lovely to talk to you and nice to see you again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you.